Welcome, brave souls, to a tale unlike anything you've heard before. Tonight, we dive deep into the cold, desolate wilderness of Alaska, where secrets buried beneath the ice are waking up and nothing is as it seems. This is no ordinary story. What starts as a government experiment gone wrong soon spirals into something far darker, something ancient, relentless, and terrifying. What happens when the dead don't stay dead? When the monsters you think you know start to become something far worse? This is Operation Permafrost. Stay with us as we uncover the chilling truth that has been hidden in the ice for centuries. Are you ready to face the cold with us? Let's begin. Michael Trevino had worked at the Department of Defense for nearly his entire adult life. His job was simple: manage data, input reports, and convert paper documents into digital files. There was nothing extraordinary about his work, nothing that would ever raise suspicion. But Michael had never suspected that his ordinary job would lead him to something so far from ordinary. It all started one morning when a stack of old paperwork was dropped on his desk. This was a routine task, a quarterly data update. Nothing special, nothing urgent. But amidst the files was something that caught his attention: a manila folder, slightly worn and folded, wedged between two personnel reports. The label read Operation Permafrost in bold letters, followed by a string of numbers that didn't match any of the systems he was used to working with. Michael immediately felt an unsettling chill run down his spine. He opened the folder, unable to shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something he shouldn't. Inside were satellite images of what appeared to be research facilities buried deep beneath the snow, with geological surveys detailing underground formations in southern Alaska. But what made his stomach twist was a single piece of paper: Cryogenic Preservation Protocol Human Trials Phase 3. The chilling phrase made his pulse race. Human trials? What kind of experiments were they conducting? A sense of foreboding washed over him. He should have reported the misfiled documents immediately. Protocol dictated it. But instead, he pulled out his phone and began taking photos of the pages. Why? Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe he felt like he had just stumbled upon something monumental. Whatever the reason, that decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. 2 days later, Michael was called into a sterile, windowless meeting room. Two men, dressed in business suits, neither military nor government, sat across from him. They didn't mention the folder, but their eyes never left him. They asked him questions about his schedule, his access to certain areas, and whether he'd noticed anything unusual. He lied, denying that anything out of the ordinary had happened. They let him go without incident. But later that night, when Michael returned to his apartment, he found that something was terribly wrong. Nothing was physically disturbed, but there was a coldness in the air, as if someone had been there and left without a trace. His laptop had been moved, and his backup drive, the one where he had stored the photos, was gone. Panic set in. He knew then that the security breach wasn't just an accident. Someone was watching him, and it wasn't just a random break-in. Michael couldn't stay in his apartment anymore. He immediately withdrew all the money from his bank account and packed a bag. He didn't have a plan, but he knew one thing: he needed to get as far away from DC as possible. 3 days later, Michael found himself at a rundown motel just outside Buffalo. He had no idea what he was running from or where to go next. But then an email popped up on his burner phone, sent by Darius Wright, his colleague at the DoD. The message was a link to an article that read, "Fire destroys building of Michael Trevino. 3 dead, including a couple next door." His hands trembled as he read the article. His apartment had burned down and 3 people had died, including his neighbors. But he hadn't heard about the fire. It didn't make sense. How had they found him so quickly? How had they covered their tracks? The truth hit Michael hard. He wasn't just a target. He was being hunted. The site he had stumbled upon, Site Mimir, was no longer just an office mistake. It was something bigger, darker, and far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. With that revelation, Michael knew there was no turning back. He couldn't go back to the safety of his normal life anymore. The operation, the experiments, and the deadly secrets hidden beneath the ice in Alaska were calling to him, and he couldn't just walk away. Michael's heart pounded as he sped down the highway, the tires of his rental car screeching against the icy road. He had no destination, no real plan, just the overwhelming need to get away. The weight of the discovery about Sight Mimir pressed down on him like a vice. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth he had uncovered was much darker than anything he could have imagined. And the fact that they, whoever they were now after him made the night feel colder, even though the temperature outside was already plummeting. His mind raced with the implications of what he had learned. Cryogenic preservation, human trials, and unidentified experiments. He had stumbled upon a government operation that he was not supposed to know about. But the strange thing was, it wasn't just the secrecy that bothered him. It was the shiver down his spine, the sense that what was hidden in those files was far more dangerous than anyone could believe. As the snow began to swirl around the headlights of his car, Michael tried to calm his mind. The emails, the warning, the way his apartment had been destroyed, all of it pointed to the same thing. He was no longer a part of the world he once knew. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was an anonymous message. A single sentence, simple but chilling. They know where you are. You're not safe. Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He knew he couldn't go back to his apartment. He couldn't trust the people he once worked with. They were watching him. The paranoia was starting to creep in, but there was no turning back now. He didn't even feel the cold of the wind seeping through the cracks of his car. All he felt was the weight of everything that had been unleashed. The night dragged on, the blizzard outside growing worse. The wipers on the car struggled to clear the snow, the roads slippery and treacherous. It was as if the entire world was conspiring to bury him under its weight. The flashing lights of his dashboard illuminated his face, casting harsh shadows across his features. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror and saw a man on the edge, a man who had been pulled into something he didn't understand, something far beyond his control. Eventually, after what felt like hours of driving, Michael reached Buffalo, stopping at a shabby motel on the outskirts of town. The building seemed to sag under the weight of time, the flickering neon sign barely visible through the thick snow. He parked his car and quickly went inside, paying for a room with cash and refusing to give any personal information. The receptionist gave him a look but didn't ask questions. Once inside the room, Michael locked the door and threw himself on the bed, his mind still spinning. The low hum of the motel's heating system did little to soothe him. He had 1,000 thoughts racing through his mind, each one more terrifying than the last. What had he stumbled upon? What was Sight Mimir, really? What kind of experiments were they conducting up there in the Alaskan wilderness? And most importantly, why was he the one being hunted? His phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, it wasn't an anonymous number. It was from his colleague Darius Wright. Michael hesitated before opening it. It was brief. "They're looking for you. I don't know how much longer we can keep this quiet. Get out of there. Now." Michael's pulse quickened. Darius. He had been the one person he trusted. But now, after everything that had happened, Michael wasn't so sure. He had no idea who to trust anymore. He couldn't even be sure if Darius was trying to help him, or if he was part of the web that was closing in around him. He needed answers. With that thought, he grabbed his bag and pulled out the manila folder he had taken from his office. He had to look through it again. The photos, the documents, the satellite images. He needed to see if there was something he missed. Maybe, just maybe, there was a clue that could help him understand what was really going on. He spread the photos across the small desk in the motel room, the dim light from the desk lamp casting an eerie glow on the documents. The images were blurry, but enough to show the research facilities buried deep beneath the snow, the geological surveys of the subterranean structures in southern Alaska. But there was something more. Personnel transfer requests to Sight Mimir that didn't exist in any database. He noticed one particular document that stood out, a list of names, some of which Michael recognized from his work at the Department of Defense. And next to their names, there were strange codes, some with active next to them, others marked as deceased. Michael felt his stomach tighten. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing, but there was no denying it. People had been disappearing, vanishing into a black hole in the middle of nowhere, and the fact that he had just accidentally stumbled upon it made everything that much worse. Then, there it was, A single piece of paper, a protocol sheet that outlined emergency evacuation procedures for Site Mimir. The instructions were chilling. They described a containment breach involving test subjects, human subjects, modified through cryogenic preservation and genetic manipulation, who had escaped their containment. The rules were simple and yet terrifying. If snow or ice forms inside any heated structure without an identifiable source, evacuate immediately. If you hear your name called, do not respond. Michael read it twice, the words sinking into his mind like ice. He couldn't comprehend everything, but one thing was clear. Whatever they were doing at Site Mimir was far worse than anything he could have imagined. Suddenly, a knock at the door startled him. Michael froze, his heart racing. He hadn't expected anyone. His hand instinctively went to the gun he'd picked up from his car, his fingers trembling as he moved toward the door. Another knock, this one louder. "Michael, open up. It's Darius." His breath caught in his throat. Darius? Was he really here? Or was this just another trick, another part of the game? He stayed silent, his eyes flicking to the window. He saw a figure standing in the dark, but it was too far away to make out any details. The knock came again, this time more urgent. "Michael, we don't have much time. They know you're here. Please, let me in." Michael's mind raced. Was this really Darius? Or was it someone else, someone trying to lure him into a trap? He didn't know who to trust anymore. The cold was biting, unrelenting as it cut through Michael's worn jacket. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, an oppressive mass that threatened snow at any moment. He could feel the weight of the decision he'd made, to go deeper, to confront the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The moment he had pulled the trigger and shot the mimic, the consequences had become crystal clear. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a war. A war against something far more dangerous than any government agency or organization. Whatever they were doing at Site Mimir, whatever had been unleashed in the frozen wilderness, it was evolving. The old, worn-down Jeep he had stolen from Lloyd's cabin sputtered over the icy road, tires struggling to find traction. Kodiak Island, a place that had once been a simple, decommissioned naval facility, was now ground zero for something far worse than Michael could have ever imagined. He remembered Pete Osborne's warning, "Don't trust anyone in Glen Allen. There are eyes everywhere." But Michael knew one thing. He needed answers. And if Darius Wright was to be believed, if he was indeed trustworthy, then Lloyd Atwood was his last connection to understanding what had been happening at Site Mimir. The hours seemed to stretch on as the cold, brutal wind howled against the Jeep, pushing him further into the heart of Alaska's frozen wilderness. The road seemed endless, winding through dense forest past towering peaks, until finally the headlights illuminated the faint outline of Glen Allen, a tiny dot of civilization amidst the vast, unbroken wilderness. Glen Allen felt like a place where time had stood still. The town was small, tiny, really, and the people seemed as weathered as the buildings, their faces hardened by decades of isolation. Michael could see them as he passed by, old men sitting in front of rusted shops, eyes watching every passing car as if they were all potential threats. He knew he wasn't the first stranger they'd seen, but he felt as if they could all see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty. Michael parked the Jeep on the edge of town, just far enough to blend in but close enough to observe. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. The snow had begun to fall heavier, each flake a whisper against the stillness of the night. He pulled the collar of his jacket up and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed to find Lloyd Atwood, but he had no idea where to begin. The Rusted Nail, the local bar, was the first place he'd been told to go. Pete had made it clear that Lloyd could be found there, and if he was going to get any answers, this was his best shot. The cold seemed to grow even harsher as he stepped out of the Jeep and made his way toward the bar. Every step was muffled by the snow, every breath like shards of glass in his chest. The Rusted Nail loomed ahead, its neon sign flickering like the last pulse of a dying light. He pushed open the door, the warmth inside instantly hitting him like a wave, but it didn't feel welcoming. No, it felt suffocating. Too warm, too alive for the eerie stillness outside. Inside, a few men sat scattered at the tables, nursing drinks, each of them with eyes that seemed to watch Michael the moment he walked in. The bartender, a middle-aged man with a permanent frown, glanced up at him before going back to polishing a glass. Michael ordered a whiskey, trying to blend in, though the tension in his gut kept his hands from being steady. He was searching for a man who had disappeared into the shadows of this small, desolate town. But the longer he stood there, the more it felt like he was being drawn into something far darker than he was prepared for. A voice behind him made him jump. Lloyd doesn't have friends, especially not soft-handed outsiders who don't know how to dress for Alaska. Michael turned slowly. The man was older, his face scruffy with a graying beard, his clothes weathered from years of hard labor in the wilderness. His eyes were sharp, assessing. "I'm not looking for trouble," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Trouble finds you here, boy. You looking for Lloyd Atwood?" Michael hesitated, but then nodded. He couldn't afford to waste time with games. "Fimblewinter," Michael said quietly, using the word that Pete had told him would get him some sort of response. The man's face shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible reaction, but it was enough. He set his glass down and stood up, motioning for Michael to follow him. "You've made a mistake coming here," he muttered as he led Michael out into the night. "Lloyd's not someone you want to meet, but if you're serious, I'll take you to him." The wind had picked up again, swirling in vicious gusts as they walked through the town, the snow now coming down in thick sheets, blurring the world into a monochrome haze. Michael's breath hung in the air, each step seeming to carry more weight than the last. They stopped at a nondescript building on the edge of town, its windows covered with old newspapers and boards. It didn't look like much, a rundown shack at best. The man knocked twice, paused, then knocked again, a pattern that made Michael uneasy. The door creaked open, and for a split second, Michael thought he saw the figure of a man watching him from inside, someone who had been waiting. The man from the bar stepped aside. "Go on in," he said, his voice low. Michael stepped inside, the warmth immediately enveloping him like a heavy blanket. The room smelled of wood smoke and something sharper, more medicinal. Lloyd Atwood was sitting at a table near the fire, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes dark and tired, but with a sharpness that didn't belong in this place. "You're here?" "Huh?" Lloyd said, looking up from the table, his voice raspy. "Didn't think you'd make it this far." Michael nodded, but didn't speak. There was something about the man's eyes that told him Lloyd knew more than he was letting on. "I didn't want to come to you," Michael said, finally speaking up. "But I'm stuck. I need to know what's going on at Mimir. I need answers." Lloyd's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he stood up. The walls seemed to close in a little, and Michael felt the weight of the situation start to sink in. "You're looking for answers you're not ready to hear," Lloyd said quietly. "What happened at Mimir? It's already bigger than you think." Lloyd paused, turning toward a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. When he returned, he held a weathered, leather-bound journal in his hands, its pages yellowed with age. He tossed it onto the table between them. "You'll want to read this," he said, his voice now grave. "Everything you need to know is in here. But understand this, it's not just some experiment. This is the beginning of something much worse." Michael reached for the journal, his fingers trembling slightly. As he flipped open the pages, his heart sank. The notes were frantic, filled with half-written thoughts and warnings, sketches of what looked like humanoid figures, but with limbs that were all wrong. He read about the cryogenic trials, about genetic modifications, and about the creatures that had been awakened in the cold, dark depths of Site Mimir. Michael's mind raced, the pieces falling together in a horrifyingly familiar pattern. What they had unleashed was no longer human. It was something else, something ancient, something dangerous, and now it was free. Lloyd's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and unyielding. "Whatever you do, don't trust the cold." He paused, staring hard at Michael. "It's not just the weather you need to fear, it's what's hiding in it." Michael sat motionless at the wooden table, the leather-bound journal in front of him like an anchor to the reality he wished he could escape. The words on the pages seemed to blur and shift, the once clear writing now a haze of disjointed thoughts, scribbles, and warnings. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned each page, each one revealing more about the horrors lurking beneath the ice in Site Mimir. The deeper he read, the clearer it became that the experiments conducted at this isolated location weren't just a government failure, they were a catastrophe waiting to unfold. The details were haunting. Cryogenic preservation had begun as a military project, a way to preserve soldiers, to freeze them until they could be revived in the future. But somewhere along the way, it turned into something much darker. Michael read the notes about the first few test subjects, people pulled from the streets, the homeless, the forgotten. They were promised better lives, a chance at survival, only to end up as lab rats in a frozen nightmare. The journal described the coldness of the facility, a chilling, unyielding cold that seeped into the bones of anyone who entered. The scientists had done what they believed was necessary to create soldiers who could endure the frozen tundra, but instead, they had created monsters, human bodies merged with something ancient, something that should never have been disturbed. Michael's breath caught as he read a passage about the first test subject who had failed, Subject 16. He had been the first to awaken, the first to speak after the cryogenic sleep. The words he spoke echoed in Michael's mind, as if he could still hear them reverberating from the pages. "I can feel the ice inside me." What had they awakened, and why had it come to this? Michael could feel the air in the room growing colder, the shadows deeper. Every breath he took felt heavier than the last, as if the journal was pulling him into the same frozen hell where the test subjects had been trapped. He glanced up, meeting Lloyd's gaze, which had hardened since the moment Michael opened the book. "I didn't want you to see this," Lloyd said, his voice low, almost regretful. "But you need to know. You need to understand what we're up against." Michael swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. "What are they? These things? What did they do to them?" Lloyd's eyes flickered, a flash of something haunted passing through them. He reached for his cigarette, lighting it with a shaky hand. The smoke curled in the dim light of the cabin, and for a moment, everything felt suffocating. Michael's chest tightened as he waited for the answer. "They call them mimics," Lloyd said, his voice barely a whisper. At least that's what the researchers started calling them after they learned to mimic everything. Even us. Michael's blood ran cold. The implications of those words hit him like a tidal wave. Mimic, the word lingered in the air, its meaning unraveling like a rope. These creatures, whatever they were, could copy humans. They could become us, and once they did, they would be impossible to stop. Lloyd leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly. They modified them. They gave them human traits, but they also altered their DNA, added something that was never supposed to be there. Something ancient, something alive in the ice. And when they started waking up, they weren't human anymore. Not fully. Michael's heart skipped a beat. His thoughts raced as he tried to piece together the horror of what Lloyd was saying. These weren't just tests for cold resistance or military advantage. They were creating something far more dangerous, something that had been waiting beneath the ice for centuries. "And now they're loose," Lloyd continued, his voice growing darker. "They're out there, in the wilderness. They know how to hide. They know how to blend in." Michael stared at him, struggling to grasp the full weight of the situation. "What are we supposed to do?" Lloyd took a long drag from his cigarette, staring out the window. "We survive. That's all we can do now. And you, Michael, you need to stop digging, because the more you uncover, the closer they get. And once they find you, there's no escaping." Michael felt the truth of Lloyd's words settle into his bones like the cold. There was no escape, not anymore. The deeper he went into this mystery, the more entangled he became in a web spun by powers beyond his understanding. As he absorbed everything, something stirred in the back of his mind. The rules. He remembered the protocols from the journal, the warnings. Don't respond to your name. Stay in the cold. Never trust the warmth. But why? It wasn't long before Michael realized. The mimics were adapting. They were evolving, learning how to use the environment to their advantage. They could manipulate heat signatures. They could distort reality. And worst of all, they could speak, even call you by your name, using voices that sounded too real, too familiar. Michael's pulse quickened as the reality sank in. The mimics weren't just monsters. They were using the human mind as their gateway, getting inside it, crawling into the deepest recesses of a person's thoughts. And once they did, there was no getting out. A loud crack from outside the cabin startled Michael, pulling him from his thoughts. His heart skipped in his chest, adrenaline surging. Pratt, Lloyd's hand instinctively moved toward the shotgun propped against the wall, his eyes narrowing. Michael knew that something was wrong. Someone was here. The wind howled outside, but it wasn't the wind that made the hairs on the back of Michael's neck stand on end. It was the feeling that someone was close, too close. Lloyd stood up, his eyes scanning the dark room, his expression hardening. "Stay here," he whispered. "Don't move." Michael didn't have to be told twice. He knew that the next few minutes could be the difference between life and death. Every instinct in him screamed to run, but he stayed still, his heart pounding in his chest. A shadow moved outside the window, and Michael's breath caught in his throat. The figure was too still, too perfectly still. It was watching him. Lloyd moved quickly toward the door, but Michael grabbed his arm. "Lloyd, wait." Lloyd's eyes were wide now, his face paling. "I'll handle this." "You need to get out of here." But it was too late. The door burst open and the air turned cold, unnaturally cold. The room seemed to freeze in an instant. Michael felt the air around him shift, growing thicker. He stepped back, his gaze locking onto the figure that stood in the doorway, its features too perfect, too human. But it wasn't. The eyes were wrong. Michael Trevino. The voice was smooth, too smooth, like velvet, but carrying an unnatural echo that vibrated in Michael's chest. It was mimicking him. The air around Michael seemed to hum, the warmth inside the room vanishing into the cold as if it were being siphoned away, pulled toward something far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. The mimic stepped forward, its movements fluid, inhumanly perfect. Michael's heart raced, his body locked in place by the intense terror coursing through him. It was only a matter of seconds before it would be over. He had to act. He couldn't let it get to him. But how could he stop something that had already mastered the art of mimicry? Michael's heart raced as the mimic stepped into the room, the cold air swirling around its form like a storm. The moment it crossed the threshold, it seemed as though the room itself had surrendered to the frozen wilderness outside. The heat in the cabin evaporated, leaving only unnatural cold in its wake, an oppressive chill that sank deep into his bones. His breath clouded in front of him, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was the presence of the creature, the cold, lifeless air that it carried with it, as if it were siphoning the warmth from everything it touched. Michael's instincts screamed for him to move, to run, but his body was frozen, his mind racing to process what was happening. The mimic, this creature that wore human flesh, had crossed the line between life and death, and it was here in front of him, mimicking the very thing that made him human. Fear, desperation, and now the unsettling feeling that he was completely out of his depth. The creature stood in the doorway, its eyes reflective like two black mirrors, glowing with a strange, otherworldly sheen. Michael could see himself in those eyes, but there was something deeply wrong about it. The reflection wasn't quite him. It was twisted like the shape of a man trapped inside a cage of ice. It wasn't human. Michael Trevino. The voice that came from the mimic was soft, almost seductive, but it held an undercurrent of something far darker, an unnatural resonance that vibrated through Michael's chest. "You are not supposed to be here." Michael's breath hitched and his body tensed. The mimic's words felt like ice cutting through his very soul. It wasn't speaking to him as if it knew him. No, it was speaking to him as though it were him, as if the creature had stolen his identity, had become him in every way except for one thing, the eyes. It had his voice, but its eyes were alien. They were not human. In that instant, Michael realized what was happening. The creature wasn't just mimicking appearances. It had the ability to replicate memories, to crawl into the recesses of his mind and twist everything he believed he knew about himself. It was hunting him, not for his body, but for his identity, for the very core of who he was. The room felt suffocating, the walls pressing in on him with a terrifying, silent weight. The mimic took a slow step forward, and Michael instinctively took a step back. The movement was fluid, precise, like an animal moving toward its prey. Too graceful, too calculated. It wasn't just walking, it was gliding, untouchable by the laws of nature. Every movement it made was deliberate, like it had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. It didn't need to chase him. It had already found him. "Don't be afraid, Michael." The mimic's voice softened, almost reassuring, as though trying to calm him. But there was something else there, a promise in the way it spoke, like it knew something he didn't. We can make this easier. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears, and his breath quickened. He wanted to run, but his legs felt as though they were made of lead. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to get out of the room and away from this creature. But he couldn't move. His body was paralyzed by the terror of seeing what should have been a man, what should have been human, now nothing more than a creature of the ice. Then the mimic spoke again, but this time it was different. It wasn't in its own voice. It wasn't trying to be Michael, it was being him. The voice was his, and the words it spoke echoed like his own thoughts, memories that no one but Michael should know. I'm not afraid of you. His own words. His own thoughts. It spoke them with such accuracy, such precision, that Michael's stomach twisted. How did it know what he was thinking? How did it know his every move, his every instinct? The mimic wasn't just a shapeshifter. It was a mind reader, a manipulator of memories and thoughts. The cold in the room intensified, creeping into Michael's skin, freezing his body in place. He couldn't think. He couldn't move. Every breath felt heavy, like the very air around him had thickened, weighed down with a malevolent presence. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words stuck in his throat. The mimic was inside his head, and it knew exactly how to push him to the edge. We are not so different, Michael. The mimic's voice cut through his mind again, smooth and unyielding. I am what you were always meant to become. Michael's chest tightened, his heart hammering against his ribcage. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The ice was closing in. It was suffocating him, choking the life out of him. And the only thing he could do was watch as the mimic, this creature born of ice and shadow, inched closer, its hands outstretched, its eyes locking onto his. And then, like a jolt of electricity, Michael felt something else. Heat. Unexplainable warmth flooded his body, seeping through his clothes and into his very skin. His thoughts clouded, his vision blurred as his limbs grew heavy. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. The mimic's face twisted into what could have been a smile, but it wasn't a smile. It was a predatory grin filled with malice and hunger. And Michael realized with sudden clarity that it wasn't trying to hurt him. Not yet. It wanted to consume him. It wanted to replace him, and in that moment, he understood. The mimic wasn't just mimicking humanity. It was taking over, piece by piece. It was using the cold to preserve its prey. And then, when the moment was right, it would emerge, perfectly human, but completely inhuman. With the warmth overwhelming him, Michael could feel his body giving in. His thoughts were slipping away, his awareness drowning in the heat that the mimic had conjured around him. His arms and legs grew weak, and he could feel his mind starting to lose control. But then, just as he thought it was over, something snapped. A loud crash echoed from behind the mimic, followed by the sound of footsteps. Real footsteps, not the silent gliding of the mimic. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he saw Lloyd Atwood burst into the room, a shotgun in his hands. Without hesitation, Lloyd leveled the weapon at the mimic. "Get away from him!" Lloyd shouted, his voice filled with fury and desperation. The mimic turned slowly, its eyes narrowing as though calculating its next move. It didn't flinch, didn't move to escape. It simply stood there like a creature that had already won. But Lloyd didn't hesitate. With a violent motion, he pulled the trigger, and the shotgun blast echoed through the cabin, the force of it sending the mimic staggering back. The room was filled with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. Michael's vision swam, his body weak and trembling, but through the haze he saw the mimic's body flicker, its form shifting, its human face cracking like ice as the invisible force of its true nature tried to break free. "You're not taking him. Not today." Lloyd spat, his voice grim as he readied the shotgun again. The mimic let out a low, inhuman growl, and then, with a swift movement, it darted towards the door. But before it could reach the exit, it hesitated, turned its alien gaze back toward Michael, and for a brief moment the room felt utterly frozen again. The mimic's eyes locked onto Michael's, and in that brief, eternal moment, he felt it, its presence inside him, burrowing deeper into his soul, pulling at the very core of his being. Then in an instant, it was gone. The storm raged outside, howling through the trees like a living thing. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. Michael sat in the corner, his hand clutching the fabric of his jacket, his mind racing, still reeling from what had just happened. He had come so close, too close to being consumed by the thing that was not human. The mimic had vanished after Lloyd's shotgun blast, but Michael knew it was not gone. It never really left. It was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Lloyd was sitting across from him, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. His face was etched with weariness, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the table. The cabin was silent now, the storm outside muffled by the thick walls of the log building. Michael wanted to speak, but he found himself unable to find the right words. How do you ask a man who's seen too much about the unspeakable horrors he's been living with? Lloyd broke the silence first. You don't know what you're dealing with, Michael. Michael's head snapped up. What do you mean? Lloyd sighed deeply, his gaze drifting toward the window as if searching for answers that weren't there. These creatures, these mimics, they don't just change their form, they change everything, their thoughts, their behaviors, their very essence. They learn, adapt, and over time, they start to become the person they're imitating. He paused as if choosing his words carefully. They don't just mimic you, they invade you, they take everything you are. The weight of Lloyd's words sank into Michael's chest, heavy and suffocating. He had always feared the unknown, but this was something beyond anything he had ever imagined. The idea that something could steal your identity, your very essence, and leave behind only a husk of who you were. It was terrifying. But they're not, Michael started to say, his throat dry. They're not human. They're monsters. Lloyd looked at him, his eyes dark and full of something that Michael couldn't quite place. No, they're not human, but they're also not monsters, at least not in the way you think. They were created, Michael. These creatures were made, engineered, and they've been waiting for this moment, this opportunity to break free and spread. He leaned forward, his hands clenched tightly in front of him. They were never meant to be contained. Michael's mind reeled as he tried to process everything Lloyd was telling him. He wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into this twisted nightmare, but part of him feared what he might learn. Part of him didn't want to understand just how deep the darkness went. Lloyd's voice was low, almost a whisper, as he continued. You've been marked, Michael. The moment you opened that folder, the moment you started digging into this, you became a target. They know who you are. And now they'll do whatever it takes to silence you. You're not just dealing with a government operation gone wrong. You're dealing with something much bigger, something ancient, and you're caught in the middle of it. Michael's heart raced as the cold realization settled in. He wasn't just running from a rogue government agency or secret experiments. He was running from something much older, something that had been buried in the ice for centuries, just waiting to be awakened. And now it had found him. His gaze turned to the journal on the table between them, the pages still open to the last entry he had read. There was more to this, so much more. The experiment at Site Mimir had started as a way to preserve soldiers, to keep them frozen until they were needed. But that was just the surface. Beneath that, the truth was far more sinister. The scientists had found something in the ice, something that was never meant to be found. An ancient organism, trapped in the permafrost, its genetic code unlike anything they had ever encountered. It had been dormant for millennia, waiting to be awakened. But it wasn't just an organism, it was a virus, a parasite. And once it bonded with a human host, it began to change them. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about taking control. Michael could feel his stomach churn at the thought. How many people had already been lost to this thing? How many test subjects had been turned into these creatures, or had these mimics? Lloyd's voice broke through his thoughts again, bringing him back to the present. There's a reason they called it Operation Permafrost. They were testing the boundaries of human endurance, pushing the limits of what the human body could survive. But in the process, they unleashed something far more dangerous. And now it's out, and it's spreading. Michael's head snapped up. Spreading? How? What do you mean? Lloyd leaned back in his chair, the wariness in his eyes deepening. It's already spreading, Michael. They started at Mimir, but it's not contained anymore. It's out in the wild, in the ice, in the land itself, and it's only a matter of time before it starts to affect the rest of the world. They've already begun adapting to the environment. And worse, they're learning. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. The creature, the mimic, wasn't just a threat confined to Site Mimir anymore. It was already out there, waiting, evolving, growing stronger by the day. "What do we do?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lloyd's gaze darkened. "We fight, we survive, and we stop them from getting any further. Because if they manage to break free of the ice entirely, the world as we know it will change forever." The weight of the situation settled over Michael like an avalanche, and he knew, deep down, that there was no going back. The world was on the brink of something terrifying, and he had no choice but to stand at the edge of it and face the unknown. There was no more hiding, no more running. The game had changed, and Michael was right in the center of it. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the distance, cutting through the cold air like a gunshot. Michael's heart stopped for a moment, the world freezing around him. "Get down!" Lloyd shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. He immediately grabbed Michael's arm and yanked him to the floor. The sound of heavy footsteps could be heard, approaching rapidly, too rapidly. Michael's mind raced. Who was out there? Were they already surrounded? Lloyd's eyes locked onto Michael's, his face grim. "It's them. They found us." The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until the world seemed to close in on Michael and Lloyd. The small cabin, once a safe refuge, now felt like a trap. The storm raged outside, but inside there was an eerie stillness, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Michael's pulse quickened, each beat drumming in his ears. They were here. The mimics had found them, and now there was no escape. Lloyd didn't hesitate. He grabbed Michael's arm, yanking him toward the far corner of the room. "Stay low and stay quiet," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. The shotgun was in his hand again, but it felt like a fragile weapon against the sheer terror of what was coming. Michael could hear the distinct sound of boots crunching through the snow outside, and his mind raced. How long did they have? Minutes? Seconds? The mimics didn't need to storm the cabin. They didn't need to break the door down or even enter the room. They had already infiltrated his thoughts, his memories, and now they were closing in on him from every angle, ready to take what they wanted. Michael pressed himself flat against the cold floor, trying to still his breathing. The familiar smell of pine and wood smoke filled the room, but all he could focus on was the faint creak of the floorboards above. He knew they were waiting, watching, listening. Lloyd crouched beside him, his face grim and set with determination. He motioned to the small window by the door, and Michael followed his gaze. Through the frost-covered glass, he could barely make out the figures moving just beyond the cabin. The mimics, dressed in dark winter gear, were slowly circling the building, methodical and deliberate. The way they moved, so fluid, so unnatural, made Michael's stomach twist. It was as if they were hunting, learning, and adapting with every step. "They know we're inside," Lloyd whispered, his voice low. "We can't stay here much longer. We have to move, now." Michael's mind raced. Where could they go? The wilderness outside offered no protection, only more danger. There was no safe place anymore. The mimics were relentless, their ability to adapt and evolve making them unstoppable. They were perfect predators. Lloyd stood up, his eyes scanning the cabin one last time before he moved toward the back door. "We'll have to make a run for it. There's a trapdoor in the back of the cabin that leads to an old mine shaft. It's our only shot." The air felt thick with tension as they moved toward the back of the cabin. Michael's legs felt unsteady, his body fighting against the growing sense of hopelessness. What was the point of running? The mimics could follow them anywhere. The only way out seemed to be through, but Michael knew they didn't have much time. Just as Lloyd reached for the trapdoor, there was a sharp crack from the front of the cabin, like a loud gunshot echoing through the walls. It was followed by a low growl, something unmistakably inhuman, and the hairs on the back of Michael's neck stood on end. The mimic was already inside. Lloyd cursed under his breath, his hand gripping the shotgun so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "It's now or never, Michael." He pulled open the trapdoor with a swift motion, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading downward. Michael hesitated for a split second, but the sound of the mimic's growl filled the room and instinct kicked in. He didn't look back. He dove into the darkness, following Lloyd down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. The underground shaft was cold, colder than anything Michael had ever felt before. The air tasted like iron, thus sharp and metallic, and the floor was uneven, littered with rocks and dirt. As they descended, Michael's eyes adjusted to the dim light, the only source of illumination coming from a small flashlight in Lloyd's hand. The sound of footsteps above was growing more distant, but Michael knew they weren't safe yet. The mimics could be anywhere. They could hear them. They could smell their fear. Lloyd led the way, his every step calculated, measured. Michael followed as quickly as he could, keeping his eyes on the narrow beam of light in front of him. The walls of the mine shaft were damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. They moved in silence, each step a calculated risk, each breath a gamble. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the bottom of the mine shaft, where a small underground chamber opened up before them. The space was cramped, the walls close enough that Michael could feel them pressing in on him. But it was dark, and that was all that mattered now. Lloyd stopped, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He scanned the room quickly, then turned to Michael. "We need to keep moving. We're not safe here." Michael nodded, his mind racing. "Where are we going?" Lloyd pointed to a small, rusted elevator shaft at the far side of the room. "We're headed deeper into the mine. There's a way out through there, but it's not much better than what we've left behind." Michael swallowed hard, fear creeping up his spine. "And if we don't make it?" Lloyd's face darkened. "Then they'll come for us." The sound of scraping metal from above made Michael freeze. The mimics were getting closer. They knew they were below ground, and now they were going to use the shadows to their advantage. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he looked at Lloyd. They had to keep moving. The elevator shaft was their only chance. They moved quickly, the sound of the mimics' growls growing louder as they made their way toward the elevator. Michael's legs felt like they were made of lead, his every step growing heavier as he imagined the mimics closing in behind them. As they reached the elevator, Lloyd reached for the rusty lever, pulling it down with a loud creak. The shaft groaned, the old metal straining under the weight of the movement. With a final squeal, the elevator started its descent, rattling and shaking as it made its way down deeper into the earth. Michael's stomach turned as he stared up at the mine shaft. He could almost feel the mimic's presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for their moment to strike. The elevator descended slowly, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that felt too heavy, too unnatural. Then the floor beneath them shook, and the elevator suddenly jerked to a stop. Lloyd cursed under his breath. "We've got company." Michael's pulse skyrocketed as he looked up, his heart in his throat. From the darkness above, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, too many, too fast. And then he heard the voice. Michael Trevino. The mimic's voice was hauntingly familiar, like a voice stolen from his own mind. Michael's blood ran cold as he realized they weren't just hunting him, they had already become him. "We know you're down there." The elevator shaft was eerily silent after the final squeal of the metal faded into the distance. Michael's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing. The darkness of the mine seemed to press in on him from all sides, the dim light of the rusted elevator only making the shadows deeper and more suffocating. The sound of footsteps from above still echoed in his mind, the mimics' voices lingering in the air like an unsettling whisper, an invitation to the very core of his terror. Lloyd stood beside him, his face pale, eyes scanning the darkness above with a mixture of determination and fear. The old elevator creaked as it hung suspended in the shaft, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the deep, distant rumble of the wind outside, now muffled by the earth around them. But Michael could feel it, the ominous presence closing in. The mimics were here. They knew where they were, and it wouldn't be long before they found a way to reach them. Lloyd motioned for Michael to stay low. The urgency in his movements was clear. "We don't have much time. They'll be here soon." Michael nodded, trying to steady his breathing. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one truth kept cutting through the chaos. They weren't going to make it out of this alive unless they moved fast. They made their way down the dim-lit corridor that opened up beneath the mine. The walls were jagged, the ground uneven, and every step Michael took felt as if it might be his last. The air was thick with dust, and a faint smell of decay hung in the stagnant atmosphere. The tunnel stretched out in front of them, a maze of unknown paths, each one leading deeper into the heart of the mine, deeper into the darkness that the mimics had already claimed as their own. The further they went, the more Michael could feel the cold seeping into his bones. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the presence of something unnatural, something ancient. The mimics were alive in the ice, and they were spreading through the tunnels, through the very earth itself. Lloyd glanced back at Michael, his eyes narrowing. "You need to stay close. The mimics don't need to find us. They already know what we're capable of. They're already ahead of us in a way. We're running out of time." Michael's heart raced. They were always running out of time. The mimics had already claimed so much, so many lives, and now they were coming for them. Michael had no idea how much longer he could keep fighting, how much longer he could survive in a world where nothing was as it seemed. The stakes had escalated beyond anything he could have prepared for, but now, in the depths of the mine, there was no turning back. They reached a fork in the tunnel, and Michael felt a cold chill run down his spine. The left path seemed to descend deeper, leading into utter darkness. The right path seemed to curve upwards, leading toward what Michael hoped was some form of exit. Lloyd paused, glancing down each path, his eyes calculating the risks. "We take the right path," Lloyd said, his voice firm. "It's the only chance we have." Michael didn't argue. They took the right path, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls as they moved forward. Faster now, adrenaline kicking in. The screeching noise of metal on metal sounded in the distance. The mimics were getting closer. Suddenly, there was a flash of light in the distance, a flicker of movement. Michael's heart skipped a beat. "Lloyd," he hissed, grabbing his arm. "Look!" Ahead of them, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, Michael thought it was one of them, one of the mimics, but then he saw the familiar outline of a man. It wasn't just any man. It was Lloyd's brother, Tom. Michael's mouth went dry as he took in the sight before him. Tom was standing in the middle of the tunnel, staring at them with wide, hollow eyes. His skin was pale, the edges of his face contorted in a way that made Michael's stomach turn. He wasn't just standing there, he was waiting, his eyes fixed on them like he was expecting something. "Tom," Lloyd shouted, rushing forward. Tom, what the hell happened to you?" But Michael could already feel it, a deep, unsettling sense of wrongness. Tom's body was still, but it wasn't human. Not entirely. The mimics had already taken him. Lloyd's voice wavered. "Tom, it's me." There was no answer. Instead, Tom's eyes flickered, and his lips twisted into something that wasn't a smile. It was more like a mockery of one. The creature that stood before them wasn't just mimicking his face. It was taking everything, his soul, his identity, and twisting it into something unrecognizable. Michael felt the floor shift beneath him, the walls closing in as the temperature dropped to unnatural levels. The mimics weren't just after him. They were after everyone, after everything. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about something much darker, a force of nature that had been unleashed, and now there was no stopping it. "Get back!" Michael shouted, pulling Lloyd away. The mimic's eyes followed them, their unblinking stare cutting through the darkness. But as they retreated, another figure emerged from the shadows. A woman this time, her face covered in ice, her body shifting, her form flickering like a mirage. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he recognized her. It was Sophie, the woman he had known back in D.C. Sophie's body was moving in ways that no human body could. Her limbs bent at strange angles, her fingers too long, too perfectly wrong. She raised her hand, and Michael felt the unmistakable sense of her voice. It wasn't her, but it was her voice, her mimicked words, calling out to him. "Michael? Michael, you don't have to fight anymore." Her voice was too smooth, too calm, as if she was trying to lure him in. Lloyd raised his shotgun, his eyes burning with fury. "Get away from him!" But the creature that had once been Sophie didn't flinch. Instead, it grinned, and Michael could see the cold, inhuman hunger in its eyes. "We are you." Everything froze. For a second, Michael thought the world had stopped, but in reality, it was the mimics closing in, their trapped prey, shifting, learning, becoming. And then everything happened at once. Lloyd's shotgun blasted into the mimic, sending it crashing against the stone wall. But the mimic didn't die. It simply got up, the bullet wounds healing, the ice shifting and mending around the creature's body. It was no longer human. Michael didn't wait. He grabbed Lloyd's arm, pulling him down the path with everything he had left. The walls trembled as the mimics moved, closing in from every direction. "We have to keep going," Michael shouted, adrenaline burning through his veins. The mimics weren't just after them, they were everywhere, and Michael realized that the only way to escape was to reach the heart of the mine, where the core of this nightmare began. But in the shadows, Michael could already hear the whispers, the voice of the mimic, the voice of something ancient calling to him. And the worst part was, Michael wasn't sure if he could ever escape. Thank you for joining us on this wild, bone-chilling journey. If you've been on the edge of your seat, don't forget to show some love. Like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Every like, every comment helps us bring you more stories, more adventures, and more mysteries to unravel. Stay tuned, because the darkness is far from over. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop exploring.